Before we start, I would just say a few words about Creative Mornings so that you all know what the concept is all about in case this is your first time. So Creative Mornings is actually an international concept that started out over 10 years ago in the US, in New York. And the principle is to have a creative, inspiring talk in the morning next to a free breakfast. This is a concept that today is spread in over 200 countries. And the best part of it is that every city, every month is talking about one single topic. So this month's topic is the end. So different cities around the world will all speak about this topic. And what is interesting is to maybe go on creativemornings.com and check some of the topics that happened on the same topic in another city, and you can see that actually different cities, different speakers will tackle the topics in a very different way, which is quite inspiring as well. We are over 20,000 attendees per month. There are so many different speeches that you can get inspired by every month, so don't hesitate to have a look if you have some spare time. Today, the location, free coffee and breakfast were made by 80 Dots, this amazing place. If you have attended our February session, we also held it here and we loved it so much, and we said when it's summer we want to come back because it's such an amazing location. So I would like to ask Marta, the founder of 80 Dots, to say a few words so that you all know what this awesome place is all about.
Thank you. Welcome to 80 Dots. I'm the lucky one to be the co-founder and managing director from this beautiful place. So I see a lot of faces that I haven't seen before, so just for those that don't know who we are a digital marketing communication agency based here. And when we are not enjoying the view, we're also downstairs working on very international topics, international campaigns for our clients. We're a very international team as well. And that was one of the reasons why we decided to start a collaboration with Creative Mornings, beginning of this year. So this is our second session, as Katja said. And yeah, very happy to have you here. And I'm going to stop talking because the reason why you're here is over there. And yeah, in case you have any questions, don't hesitate to come to me afterwards. Thank you.
We also have some global partners, MailChimp, Adobe, and WordPress. And usually, so we also have the videographers and photographers who are helping out, as well as Have a Design, which is our newest local sponsor, and we're very happy to have them on board. This is our team, so today you will see, you can find us with those Creative Mornings badges around. So if you have any kind of questions about who we are, what we do, how we work, don't hesitate to hang out with us a little bit after the talk. We're always looking for new people who would like to join the team, especially we're looking for photographers, videographers, but anyone actually who is passionate by social networks, by newsletters, by anything, events organization that could help us continue doing the great morning sessions. So if you're interested, please reach out. We would be happy to have you on board. And now, without further ado, so if you get inspired by today's session, please post things on social networks, spread the news, tag your friends, tell your friends about it, about the event, and come all together next month. Or in the future, we would love to grow the community. Here are the hashtags. You can also see them around the office in case you are wondering whom to tag. And so this month's topic is end. And I'm more than happy to have next to me Alex. Alex, who is a very, very interesting and extremely creative person. A speaker that I have been so much waiting for his talk because I have heard so many good and inspiring things about his talk as well. He has a very interesting background, going from more a linguistics part into digital marketing management, writing poems on the side, and still trying to get it back to the linguistics part. So I think the talk he will deliver today is going to be very inspiring. So with no further ado, Alex, the stage is yours. Thank you for being here with us.
All right, Thanks, Katja, for that lovely introduction. I hope I live up to the expectations. Is this sort of volume okay for the back row? Can you hear it? Okay, good, thanks. Just a little heads up, I don't have any slides about me. If you want to get to know me, you can slide into my DMs. My Instagram handle is on these posters there. Also, a small heads up, I've been asked to just inform you that this is a splash zone, so if you... just kidding. I'm happy to talk about this month's topic, the end. I don't know what it says about you that you would volunteer to come to something that's entitled The End. Sort of it makes you, I guess, sort of masochistic, because I would never volunteer to go something that's called The End. But I think that's sort of usually what we associate with the end, right? There's a very strong emotions that are connected with when we talk about the end. And I just hope to change your mind a little bit today, and we can check later if I was successful or not. So, today's topic, at the end, simpler illustration than the slide before. And I guess you've read the intro. I'll be talking to you today about the end of language. And it's just a little anecdote on how and why I came about this topic. A couple of months ago, actually, I was sitting in the U-Bahn, and when I was listening to a conversation that a grandmother and her grandson had, and she was sort of looking into his screen, and she was very astonished, and then she just said, "Oh, you kids these days, you're ruining our language." And it sort of reminded me very much of a debate that was happening in 2015 when the Oxford English Dictionary announced that the word of the year would be the laughing smiley face, the laughing emoji. And it's funny now because emojis become such a part of our lives. We use them without thinking, but back then, 4 years ago, it was a huge debate also in the linguistic community. Can we consider emojis even words? What are they doing in our language? They're not bringing any value. And so I went back and I screenshotted a couple of headlines that were going on around back then. So we have one saying emojis are not the future of language. One talks about the emoji invasion, the end of language as we know it. Emojis are dragging us back into old dark times. Language is officially dead, it's cancelled over. Mark Zuckerberg officially also ended our language. And emoji, on top of everything else, also cancelled our written language. So all these sort of headlines that have a very sort of dystopian view on why and how we use emojis. And they're also they use, if you look at the headlines, they use very, very language that we normally would use to describe life, right? They talk about languages ending, they talk about languages dying. And I want to take you on a small detour, actually, before we jump into the emoji topic, on when we talk about languages dying and when are languages alive? And we use something in linguistics that's called biolinguistics, where we take principles from biology and nature and apply them to languages. And we do that because it helps us to achieve two things. First of all, it helps us to create a narrative, to speak about languages, which is very abstract. We don't know where languages came from, we don't know how we acquire language, we don't know where they're going. So it helps us to create a narrative that sort of brings some sort of resemblance into the topic. So we know life, we know nature, we know evolution, and by applying the same principles to language, it just helps us understand and wrap our minds around something that is so abstract. And second of all, we can also use the very same principles that apply to nature and apply them to actually in thinking about how languages evolve. And it might seem a very, very far-fetched because we've studied biology same way we studied languages, but it sort of seems more obvious when you think about organisms and how they evolved, and you wouldn't necessarily think about the same way when applying it to languages, but it actually works. And what we found out, what linguists found out way smarter than I am, is that languages change, and that's a fact, but they don't change because we want them to change, and they don't change the way we want them to change. And that's sort of counterintuitive, because for most of our lives, we grow up, we learn grammar rules, we learn spelling rules. When we enter kindergarten and elementary school, we're brought up to think that humans have made languages, and they've created a set of rules that allow us to learn languages, and they created these rules for us to follow, and anything but the rules is what matters. Which is actually, if you look at language and how they change, it's rules set in place by grammarians hundreds and hundreds of years ago, actually they prevent language change. And if we didn't have this set of rules, languages would change way faster than they actually do. But what I wanted you to take from this is that, again, this idea that languages evolve just as naturally, as organically, as any other part of nature does. And I wanted to emphasize this by using two examples. And one is a very extreme example, and if any French speakers are here, I apologize for my French. But France, for example, they have a state-sponsored institution called l'Académie Française, whose sole purpose of existing is protecting the French language. Whatever that means, right? I mean, it's a 40-member institution, and they call themselves immortals, and their motto is to immortality, because they believe that their job is to protect and to prevail the French language into the future. And so what they do for 40 hours of their week is to try to come up with new words for the French language, because they don't want English words, for example, being borrowed into the French language. So it's a very crass example, but that's sort of where we as humans are, right? We don't want anything to change because we're afraid of the unknown, and that's why we try to prevent it with all means necessary. And you might think, well, that's all good and nice, but I'm sure it's not always been that way. Well, actually, I brought an English example that probably most of you can relate to. 400 years ago, Latin clergy, so back then in England you would have the peasants who spoke English, and then clergy who were the only ones who could read and write, they spoke Latin. So they tried to model the English language after their Latin ideal, and to this day still, in university manuals you find this rule that you shouldn't split an infinitive. And why is that? Well, 400 years ago in Latin, you couldn't split an infinitive because in Latin the infinitive is one word. You don't have two plus a verb, you have one word to express an infinitive, which is why also the English language should never split an infinitive. So she seemed to really like it, although it sounds very natural to us. If you think about grammatical rules, it's ungrammatical because it should be. She really seemed to like it because you don't split an infinitive. And we have tons of examples like this in languages where we sort of have these arbitrary rules that tell us what to do, although they don't feel natural to us anymore. And so this is actually where I want to jump in and make the sort of the bridge to emojis, because language change happens naturally. And when we speak about emojis or digital communication, it's not the case. Nobody forced us to use emojis. Like now, it seems as if emojis are there and they're destroying the language, but actually nobody forced us to use them, right? There's no rule that says you should put an emoji at the end of your text message. And it's also coming back to this evolution idea. It happens for a reason, right? Why we use emoji, and that's because, and this is an example. I hope you, the guys in the back there, can see it. In 2011, Apple iOS introduced the emoji keyboard, so emojis were being made available to us, which is how they entered the language. And this graph is only Instagram captions, but you can see a very steep outburst in 2011 when Apple introduced the keyboard, and then 2 years later when Android followed with their keyboard. Sort of that's when shit hit the fan, right? And emojis ever since then have been with us. So we can use examples like this throughout history, and we can sort of trace back new features of language all the way back to the 1200s, and even there's theories that go further back than this in sort of creating an original language. But languages always respond to a cultural change, to societal change, to change in location. They respond to anything that's going on in real life, right? Nobody sets out to change language. And so, as with words, emojis are sometimes misused. They have a risk of miscommunication, simply because, as with any other utterance that you do, with any email that you write, with any text message, figuring out the meaning is always the job of the recipient, right? So you have this gap between the meaning that you intended to send and the meaning that is actually received on the other end. And emojis are no rule to that exception. As I just wanted to have this small little exercise. That's 3 slides, 3 tests to figure out whether we use this emoji with the intended meaning or not. So does anyone know what actually was meant by this Yes.
Say like, I don't know. But
Funny, yeah. Something I wouldn't associate it. I always use it when I want try to be very sassy, right? I use like this snarky little emoji. But actually, what it is a service desk woman or service desk man. So it's one of those job emojis, and it's supposed to be a recipient at a hotel, right?
wow.
Not to say that when you use it as I don't know, or I use it as sassy, that's not wrong. It's just not what they were intended to be. Another interesting example are the folded hands. Anyone want to take a guess at these? That's funny that you said thank you, because yes, so it is a sign of gratitude. It comes from the Japanese bowing. But actually a lot of, I had to talk with Katja, and you said, well, it's a high five, and I always use it as a praying emoji. So, just, different takes on one example. And then this is a very interesting one, which I only figured out in my research as well. Stress.
Workout.
Good. Hot. Yeah. So for me, it looks very sad, but it's a very, very specific emoji. Its name is I'm disappointed but relieved. So yeah, that's also what I thought. It doesn't look very relieved, but there you have that. But it poses an interesting question, right? Do emojis mean anything? Like, they're all fun and games, they're fun to play around with, they're fun to do this little exercise, but do emojis mean anything? And I like to take you on a trip back, though. I like to tell you a little anecdote about a small boy. He was 17 in Brooklyn, and he posted 2 emojis on his Facebook wall back in 2005 in January. A couple of hours later, the police raided his apartment. Can anyone guess what he posted?
A gun.
Yes. So he posted 2 emojis. He posted the police officer emoji. He posted the police officer emoji and the gun, which back in 2015 still looked like that. Now we only have a water pistol. But a couple of hours later, the police raided his apartment. They found the gun, and he was put before court. And a higher court then decided that they would drop the case because they couldn't prove intent, right? But basically, it would be the same as he would have written, I'm going to shoot the police today, and he was sort of arrested for terroristic threat. Why am I telling you this? I just wanted to get you aware that emojis can and will be used against you in a court of law. So
Maybe he was just listening to the song when you shot the sheriff.
Yeah, maybe, you might have been, yes. So I guess what the story proves is that it does convey some type of meaning, right? They're not all fun and games. We actually do express some type of meaning when we use emojis. And what's funny is they've been around long enough that people like, for example, this grandma that I told you about, think of emojis as these arbitrarily used smiley faces that one sort of sprinkles over their messages, but it's actually not the case. Emojis now have been used for almost 10 years, and we had the similar emoticons before that they sort of developed their own syntax and grammar on how we use them. And all these examples that I brought here today, they're not going to be surprising to you because you use them every day in that way unconsciously. So the first one is a very standard one, which we call end sentence placement or end thought placement. So you would rather receive, hey, sexy kissy face, rather than hey, kissy face, sexy. Simply because they sort of take on almost a punctuation sort of role in that they replace a comma in this first line. And this other girl tweeted out, can't believe we finally graduated, emoji, thanks for a brilliant day, emoji, 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 and then a hashtag and again an emoji. So the first expression for her is a gratitude, a disbelief, I can't believe we've graduated, then it's sort of an expression of gratitude following a string of emojis, and then a hashtag again following an emoji. So we tend to place emojis after our thoughts or an end sentence. That's pretty clear to us. Interesting enough, they also, or not interesting enough, but that's no surprise that they also follow a certain type of linearity, whether that be time or geographic location. So if you take the Santa example, Santa comes on Christmas Eve, he places the presents under the tree. So we have Santa tree presents. That just makes sense to us. When we were asked, or when you're asked, what did you do last weekend, and you wanted to express it in only emojis, you would say something like, I partied, I drank, I unwrapped present, and there was even a birthday cake. And what's funny about the gun emoji, which now looks like a water pistol, but it's one of those examples where the object that's being shot is put in first, right? So in the first example on the left, the poor ape is dying, and the second one is a reinterpretation of Planet of the Apes, right? Where the apes go crazy with the pistols. So they follow a certain type of linearity. And we all do this unconsciously, right? We place them in an order that just makes sense to us. Another example is stance first. So when we talk about stance, I mean a certain type of attitude or a certain type of emotions. We tend to place these first before we place any other emojis. And we also, when we want to express something that's emotional or sort of attitude-wise, we also tend to use multiple of the same emojis. So you would more likely be seeing the left side of this chart rather than the right side. So in case of a heartbreak, we would express the sadness first and then the heartbreak. And in case of the, I don't know what they wanted to express, but the I'm okay laughing, you would express the laughing before and then say, okay, I'm fine. Another example is agent relationship, which is also no surprise because most languages follow a certain subject-verb-object structure. So we also, when it comes to emoji, we place the agent or the subject first. So we always place the doer sort of in the beginning and then sort of the rest of the construction follows. So we've established sort of that Apple and Android, they gave us a vocabulary by introducing a keyboard. We've sort of figured out that emojis also convey a certain type of meaning. We've established that they do follow grammatical rules. So you might argue, are emojis a new language, right? Sort of like the first slide that I showed you. Those very shocked editors thought, well, is emoji replacing written language? Is it replacing English? And I don't have a clear answer for that, but I will say that, well, if you were very bold, you could say, well, it's actually not a new language. It's actually the oldest language, right? So 5,000 years ago, we find hieroglyphs in Mesopotamia, whereas the first alphabet was only invented 1,200 years ago. So for 3,800 years, people have expressed their feelings and stories just through pictorial images. Which is weird, right? So for more time that we actually have language now, pictorial languages were the norm. And it's why I also show this example with the hieroglyphs, that there seems to be an innate wish of humans to have a universal pictorial languages. We trace this back to cave paintings and hieroglyphs, where sort of it was the first take on, can we have a universal pictorial language that everyone sort of understands, although you might speak other languages. And you probably think, well, that's 5,000 years ago, that's quite a long time ago. But we can trace sort of examples of people trying to come up with pictorial languages that are universally understandable throughout history. There was Francis Bacon, a philosopher who had a take on these. And most recently, after the Second World War, there was a concentration camp survivor who he had this very strong belief that if he had invented a language that is only signs or pictorial visuals that everyone understands, something like the Second World War wouldn't happen ever again. And so he lived then in Australia, and that's sort of where he developed his sign language meaning pictorial language. And he also introduced, in his language, he didn't have any words to express anything about war, because he believed, well, if you don't have the vocabulary to talk about war, we would be at peace and everyone would understand the same thing. So if you were very bold, you could say, well, emoji is just a take on this wish, this innate wish that we want to express something universally by pictures. And there's been studies done on how universal actually emojis are. And they do prove that there are cultural differences, of course, when it comes to emoji usage. But most of the emojis that we use every day are used the same way or a very similar way universally. So the heart emoji, the laughing emoji, the crying emoji, something that's sort of universally true for regardless of what language background you have. Well, that's a very bold statement, but it doesn't help you very much, does it? So there was another take on someone who wanted to prove that emojis could serve as a separate language. And what they did is they got a couple of people who apparently were very bored, and the internet provided a platform for them to translate the whole of Moby Dick, which, in case you don't know, it's quite a book, it's 1,000 pages long, into only emojis. And they successfully finished last year, and what they did is they had a couple of people come up with translations, and then the other group of people rate these translations, and the best translations made it into the final book, which you can acquire for $200 online. But what it actually looks like is this, right? So they have the emoji and then the translation immediately after. Why do they do this? Not only because 5 strings of emoji doesn't really have the same sting to it as Call Me Ishmael, which is one of the most iconic opening lines in a novel. Also, you couldn't figure out what the meaning was by simply just reading emojis. So what does that tell us? Emojis cannot really serve as their own language, simply because they don't have the flexibility, they don't have enough vocabulary, and they lack fundamental characteristics of languages that other languages do. Coming back to the evolution, emojis cannot evolve on their own, right? Emojis are dependent on a third party to provide emojis to us. So you could come up with emojis, but you couldn't use them in every day, and they wouldn't be used globally, so there would be a lot of miscommunications. So simply because of that reason that emojis cannot evolve naturally, we can consider it as not a language. And sort of now I've wasted 20 minutes of your time just to tell you that emojis aren't a language. So what do they actually do, right? And I stand here talking to you, and you look at my face, you look at my gestures, you look at maybe my body movements. And emojis actually in writing help us to express what we call paralinguistic features or nonverbal cues, right? So when I talk to you here face to face, I can use my face, I can use my gestures, I can use my body language, I can use my volume, I can use my intonation and stuff to give you cues that you don't have in written expressions. And there's a group of people who can totally do without using emojis and still get that same point across, and that's authors, poets, novelists, who have a brilliant take on language, and they can use it in a way that it still conveys sort of paralinguistic and metalinguistic features, but normal people might need a little help or a little tool set to do that. And that's exactly what emojis provide us to do, right? They're embellishment to written expressions that go beyond a simple question mark or an exclamation point. And so emojis aren't a new language. They're also not the end of our language. They're just a tool that we use nowadays to make written expression more emotional. And that's really the core thing that I wanted to take you away from today. And I've talked a lot about emojis because I felt like this was the thing that people most related to because it's been around long enough. But there's other types of technologies and communication methods that were introduced to us recently. Instant voice messaging is becoming more and more popular amongst the youth. We have home assistants, which allow us to talk to our dishwasher, and we have digital assistants that we carry around with us every day. And all these new technologies, all these new forms of communication will allow language to change, and it will give language an opportunity to change. I couldn't find conclusive studies that prove how these already affected our language, but what, for example, I can imagine with instant voice messaging is that from the original SMS, the short message, we were sort of limited to a set of characters, and that's sort of what we stuck with. Even with WhatsApp, messages became a bit longer, but they're still not like, except if you may be crazy, but they're not paragraph long. But with voice messaging, because we don't have the need to type, we can express quite long messages in a simpler way than we would do just by writing. And it also gives us the opportunity to use intonation and volume and express emotions in another way. So we might even see a reduction of emoji in the future. With the other two, it's simply a question of when we engage with our dishwashers or with our phones, does our language change? Do we come up with different types of forming a command? So all these new types of technologies, it remains to be seen on how they affect our language. But the main point that I wanted to get across today is that whatever way they change our language, it's okay. It's not going to be the end, it's just going to be one step into the future of a naturally developed language. And so my 3 core goals today were sort of to get you out of this education system thinking where it's all about grammar and spelling and correctness. And I wanted to get you aware that languages are something more than just a set of rules, and it's not even necessary for you to follow rules. If you want to break the rules, go ahead, use your dialect, because dialects are dying, and there's nothing inherently wrong with dialects. Use double negation in English if you want to, because there's no one that says you can't. So I just wanted to get you sort of more aware of that languages is more than what we learn in school. I also wanted to just introduce the idea of language evolution. How do languages change and why do they change? This sort of organic factor that languages don't change because we want them to, but simply because they respond to a need in our time. And lastly, I just wanted to play around with the fact that emojis are all good fun and use, but really what I wanted to do is just get you to think about me when you text a smiley emoji the next time. No, but I wanted to just get you again aware of why do we use emojis, how do we use them, and sort of just get you thinking about that there's an underlying thing that we follow even if we're not consciously aware of. And I was really, so if I haven't answered these 3 points, or if you feel unclear, we can have a short Q&A session now. But what I loved about today's topic is that it provided me with a perfect ending slide. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. This has been really fun and very informative. Let's open the floor to discussions, to questions. Who wants to? Please, there at the back.
Yeah, I was wondering, how do you apply all this research that you're doing in your daily job?
That's a good question, because I don't know if I consciously do. With my background in linguistics, of course, I have a general awareness of what language can do and the capabilities of it, and it does allow me to apply rules where I think it's appropriate and break them where I think it's not. So I guess I couldn't say that I consciously go about writing an email saying, that's the way to do it. I think for me, after a certain time now, thinking about languages comes naturally. But I do believe that just getting yourself aware that what we consider as a standard of a language, whether that be Hochdeutsch or a standard English, RP, Queen's English, whatever you want to call it, it's just one substract of a language, right? And so these standards are set by grammarians who believe that this is the norm. And of course, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a norm because it helps other people learn languages if there are a set of rules. But I do believe that we should break them more often than we do. Yeah.
If I may just add to this, because it's an interesting thing that I actually experienced in the past. We were at some point working with a digital marketing agency, and the target audience were millennials, and they were like, okay, we should go out with a campaign with emojis. And we started mainly the discussion, is everyone understanding these emojis in the right ways? Because sometimes, for instance, just the emoji with the tongue, people understand this in a very different ways. Some people would understand it as something cheeky and funny. Some others would understand it as something very sexual, and it's very, very tricky. So at the end, I think we only put the normal smiley face in there. But I think even on a daily basis, especially in the creative industry, this could actually be very useful, to have this reflection that we just had. Just a little intermezzo. Please, there in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me to listen to you today, because I've been living in Germany for 23 years, and of course my German is good,
but I hate the grammar because I always get it wrong. And so now I go out of here today thinking, wow, I'm changing the language.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that you mentioned this, right? Because in linguistics we have this thing that's called idiolect, right? And it's one specific dialect that's specific to one person. So one individual dialect is an idiolect. And so when you speak German, of course, you develop a sort of idiolect that sort of makes the most sense for you. And I do believe that it's going to be mutually understandable for everyone. And so also coming back to bilinguals, it's actually proven that when you sort of have this either very strong accent or you make mistakes in a foreign language, usually by native speakers it's received as very well. So nobody would look down on you just simply because you made a mistake in a language that's not your mother tongue, or if you use different accents. If you have a very strong German accent in your English or a French accent in your English, it's usually received as something very positive, because most people react sort of with, especially English speakers, with awe. And they're sort of in awe that somebody can speak their language, with most English speakers only being monolingual. So even that, just be bold in a language.
Because I've always been so scared to write anything in German, because I think the Germans, they always want everything to be perfect. So no, this is cool. Thank you.
So, do you believe that, or do you have a data about it, that what happens right now in the world, that people are trying to protect their own languages related to this globalization, this how many foreigners come to other countries like me, like speaking other languages that are not their own, and that makes the evolution of the languages faster, or?
Yeah, so there's a lot of theories about what will happen with the world in 50 and 100 years, because 20 years ago, for example, when English became such a major language, simply for a number of reasons, it became the #1 language in science, it became also the #1 language in media, and 20 years ago, there was this fear that at one point all the globe will speak English only, but we don't see this happening at all. So we do see, as you say, a certain protection of languages. Languages are being very well documented, just also because they want to be preserved. We do see a lot of languages dying out at a rate that is dangerous, but for all the major languages, and people think of English as sort of this enabler of globalization, right? But English, if you think about it in numbers, it's only the 3rd or 4th most spoken language. So we have Chinese and Spanish, who are spoken by way more people than actually English. And there's a number of theories what will happen with English, whether it will sort of split into a number of Englishes that are not understandable anymore. So you have sort of this Denglish and Spanglish and all these substracts of English that will not be understandable by native English speakers anymore. We also have theories that say the exact opposite, that there will emerge sort of a meta-English that sort of everyone will learn and everyone will strive through, and then we will have certain substracts that similar to what we do now, where we have sort of accent and dialects, but we still have one sort of norm of English. So, I mean, it probably won't happen in our lifetime, and it'll probably also not in the lifetime of our children, and it just remains to be seen exactly how globalization will affect languages in total. But the fact is that English will never become the most spoken language, simply because there's a number of other cultures, India and Chinese, who have way more people than English speakers. Yes.
Given the ambiguity of the emojis and how they're becoming used a lot more, do you know yourself, or do you know if there were studies at all looking at if it's actually helping language get more effective, if it's easier for people to get their point across, or if it's becoming harder to do that?
I don't have a specific study. What I did read is that miscommunication emoji happens in the same rate that it does in normal communication. So we do have this sort of cliche belief that emojis sort of misrepresentation happens more often than in normal language. Actually not the case. And to your second point, if it helps us get more effective, I don't have, again, a conclusive study, but I do believe, as I said, that when they're used sort of by non-novelists or non-authors or somebody who's not as proficient in expressing emotions in a written form, that it does help them to get the point. Simply emotions. Maybe not a point in saying, this is an argument that I want to make, and emojis help me to sort of make that argument, but simply expressing an emotional sense in an utterance, that for sure I think is helping us to do so. But as I said, it also remains to be seen with emojis where they go, right? I mean, we have now a new set of emojis that are being introduced this year, but we also have, as I said, instant voice messaging becoming so much more popular, so they might even, like NetSpeak, for example, emojis replaced sort of expressions like ruffle or lol, which we see a decline of. So again, it just remains to be seen.
I'm not sure if it's related. Do you think machine translation can totally replace the translators and editors at some point?
Well, there's also, there's even one discussion further where is machine learning the future of authors, right? Do we even need authors because we have machine learning that can write books for us? I mean, I don't know, to be honest. I would hate to see that happening because I love writing, but I guess it's, from a technical perspective, it's totally possible. And in terms of translations, I do think that it's going to become more and more accurate. Right now, we're still at a pace where we need a translator to put a language in context, but I do think that as the years progress, we will see machine learned translations be very, very accurate. Yes.
Concerning that topic, it's even happening already. We're just writing a book in English, and so the verlag told us to just put it into DL to translate it into German, and so that's what we did, and we're like, oh wow, that's pretty like fancy. Just put it in DL and it will work. Okay, that's your normal process, how you do it. And then we took it out and it was a total mess. So it doesn't help at all at the moment. But yeah, in the future I think it will.
What's DL?
It's this machine learning translator. It's even better than Google Translator, and it can translate a whole book. So you don't even put in a sentence. You can put in a whole passage or even one page or even a whole book, and it will translate it like very, very good. So from German to English, it works very good, but we found out that from English to German, it's not very good at the moment. But it's a machine learning, so every second it gets better.
Yeah, that's very nice.
So let's see how it is tomorrow.
Do you have any last questions?
And what about the stickers? So is this a new language? So after emojis, brand new, maybe?
What was that, stickers?
Stickers?
Like
There are
Yes.
group of emojis in WhatsApp and stuff like this, so you can use stickers.
Ah.
Like smiling coffee and stuff like that.
Well, they would follow the same rules as what we've laid down here. So I would argue even a more simplistic version, because you cannot put them in between sentences, right? You can only put them as a singular thing. So I would say, again, they serve the purpose of getting emotions across. I don't think that they will make an impact as emojis did, simply because there's a limited use case, right? Because you can only send one, you can't embellish a whole text with stickers.
Maybe I just have one final question. So I understand what you're saying about, you know, that the language is evolving and that that's a good thing and that it's fine if we do mistakes here and there. And at the same time, I'm thinking when I write, like not on computer, but when I write a letter by hand, I actually sometimes need to double think about the spelling because I'm so used to autocorrector and spell checkers and everything right now. And I'm thinking that to a certain extent, I mean, kids in schools, should we still teach them how to correctly spell or not? Should we encourage them to write without and check spell checkers and so on? What is your take on this? I mean, would this mean that we slowly are kind of getting in the end of the language as we know it today? Because I mean, at some point as well, if there are spelling mistakes, it's gonna be difficult to understand each other. So is this transformation always good, or may there actually be some negative or some disadvantages?
I see your point. I would just like to say I'm not a language education expert, so that was my focus of study on getting language education because it's a separate field. What I would say is I do believe handwriting, there's a decline of actually us writing in hand, and I do believe that auto checks make us think less or make us less aware of actually what we're doing when we write. The question is that a good or bad thing? How, in 20 years from now, how many messages will still be written via handwriting? As a digital agency, I would say we don't need handwriting in the future, but if that's your thing and calligraphy is your thing, then go for it. And if you do calligraphy, by the way, you might want to check on your spelling because there's no do-overs in calligraphy.
Good. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.